Okay, I might get us underway for this evening's talk. I know some of you are still coming in, but first of all, I'd like to welcome you. My name is Olivier Krischer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back, as it is, for our third talk in the Sydney Asian Art series, of which I'm the convener. I'd like to begin, as is customary. It's my privilege to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work, and from which I'm speaking today. I extend this acknowledgement to all First Nations peoples who may be joining us tonight. I will also firstly thank, and you can see some of the partners involved in this series pretending to be behind me here on the logos. And this is our partners. The series since 2017 is a partnership presented by the Power Institute at the University of Sydney with the Art Gallery in New South Wales and Viz Asia. I'd like to acknowledge this partnership. Each year we invite 4 leading scholars on timely issues in Asian art research to present and share their work through this Sydney platform. Of course, under COVID, we've also been able to move much of the series online, and it's been wonderful to also see our audience expand with many colleagues joining us both from interstate, the region, and also further afield. The title of our series this year, Troubling Images, intentionally points to the continued capacity for photographic images to be troubling, by challenging our expectations and assumptions on the one hand, so assumptions or expectations on identity, history, truth, justice, belonging, indeed on what art and visual culture constitute. But also troubling images refers to the ways the research of our invited scholars challenges and unsettles existing approaches to photography in and from Asia. And that's certainly the case with our guest this evening. It's telling that each of our speakers this year, despite focusing on photography very broadly, write on photography technically with training in a range of disciplines, including media and cultural studies, art history, and anthropology, as is the case with Professor Chris Pinney, who it is my pleasure to welcome this evening. Thank you for joining us, Chris, bright and early from London. I am going to introduce Chris briefly and pose a couple of questions, as has become customary for this series. You will find, of course, his bio profile on the event page. Chris is Professor of Anthropology and Visual Culture at the University College London. He's probably best known for his writing on photography, but as many of you will know, writes on a range of print culture, largely from South Asia, especially Central India. His work has often been, and fieldwork has often been based there. His work is also distinguished by drawing questions from this geography to bear on the theorization of photography itself, its ontology. And that's certainly the way in which my own work is engaged with Chris's theorization of the medium. Chris's current work relates to a collaborative project, some of which he'll be presenting this evening, funded by the European Research Council, titled Citizens of the Camera, Photography and the Political Imagination. But his work goes well beyond photography as well. He's written on chromolithography, popular prints of devotional and vernacular practice. In 2018, for example, more recently, Chris published 2 books, including one, Lessons from Hell, on popular images of punishment, and The Waterless Sea, a separate book on a study of mirages, just to give a sense of the spectrum of his research interests. Also, my own sort of art historical interest is in East Asia, and I must say, Chris, I've read some of your work on Japanese ukiyo-e prints at the turn of the 20th century, which I believe you also collect. So a very wide research and personal interest. By way of introduction, I'd like to begin at the beginning by asking a relatively simple question of what led your interest into photography as an anthropologist, particularly one who had been, I think, doing ethnographic research on factory workers in central India. What led you from that kind of context to write your seminal work, Camera Indica, published in 1997, which dealt with the sort of consumer experience or vernacular images in central India. Can you tell us a little bit about that kind of research journey?
Yeah, sure. I'd be very happy to. And thanks, Olivier, for organising this and for the kind invitation, which is greatly appreciated. Well, I suppose it was a series of accidents with a small bit of destiny mixed in. So I, as you say, started my PhD research on village resident industrial workers in Madhya Pradesh. So this is about halfway between, well, exactly halfway between Bombay and Delhi. And the work was driven by a set of political motives, really, and a concern with the work of the great Labour historian E.P. Thompson. So I wanted to find a greenfield industrial site. So there was also a bit of a, Blakean romanticism in there, searching for dark satanic mills and so on. Plus, I also wanted to find a way of getting close to the Indian working class, the industrial working class, which was very much in keeping with my, political objectives at the time. And then I think during the year and a half working in this village and around the nearby factory, was Asia's largest viscose rayon, semi-synthetic suiting material factory. I spent a lot of time sitting in mud jhonpries or kacha makans, village houses. And I found myself gazing up at people's chromolithographs and framed photographs and finding them more interesting than the attendance record data that I was still devotedly transcribing from people's clocking on cards. So I think during the course of that year and a half, I was converted, aesthetically converted. The luscious, voluptuous colours of these images ensnared me, derailed me. And by the end of the project, I just found myself more interested in the visual than in dry industrial data related to labour patterns. Although I did just about manage to finish my PhD on labour questions. And then fortuitously, I took a job when I was writing up the thesis as a part-time photographic librarian at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. And I think up till that point, I hadn't really had an interest in photography, certainly not archival photography. So yeah, that was a fortuitous gift. And I worked very closely with Rosalind Poignant, who's obviously very well known in Australia, the widow of Axel. And in fact, when I was first working there, I got to know Axel a little bit towards the end of his life, great Australian photographer. So it was a convergence of mostly accident, tiny bit of destiny. And then I think maybe a year after that, Homi Bhabha was editing a series for reaction books. And he suggested I write a book on popular photography in central India. So that's what became Camera Indica. So, I was very fortunate to have that generous invitation from him and to for the book to appear in a sense under his imprimatur. And Reaction, as ever, did a fantastic production job. So yes, it was a kind of dream accident.
And quite the accident, perhaps, but it's lucky for us. I wanted to, and I'm conscious at the time, but briefly, I know that there's quite a shift. A decade afterwards, in 2008, you published The Coming of Photography in India, based, of course, on the Pinney lectures that you gave at the British Library. And you yourself have kind of written about it or described it as a bit of a corrective in some sense to camera indica. And I know that I believe that some of the work that you'll be presenting today in some ways continues this arc. And so I wanted to hear from you, in your words, what you felt that shift was in the intervening decade. How do you sort of characterize it as a way of, before I hand over to you?
Yeah, well, I think those are very perceptive comments, Olivier. And I think maybe one way of describing the shift or the transition is that I've been much more willing to embrace what Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida called ontological desire. So I think, you know, when I was first writing about photography with a training as an anthropologist, my kind of default setting was that, and this very much fitted with the Taggian, Foucauldian critical theory of the time. The default setting was that photography must necessarily fragment into numerous diverse photographies, plural, under the influence of, you know, cultural embrace. So locality, vernacularization involves fragmentation. And I think, you know, one gets a sense of that in the title of my first book, Camera Indica. So, you know, camera general, specific location, India. So it's almost, well, the title tells a story, I think, about my anthropological desire to localize, to stress specificity, to stress local appropriation and divergence from any kind of normative, ontological, and to my thinking at the time then, necessarily essentialist view of photography as techne or technology. And I think what coming of photography in India helped me do was see that there were more complex responses to that question, which would allow one, maybe through thinking about photographing the gerund rather than the noun photography, and that if one was to look at processes and the complexity of processes, that would open up a subtle and complex field in which one could actually embrace that ontological desire.
That's a very rich introduction. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I'll invite you to bring up your slides, Chris, and I will be back to moderate the discussion.
Okay, so as Olivier mentioned, I'm going to give a brief report on some of the more recent work under this, conducted under this PhotoDemos project, Citizens of Photography, a European research group funded endeavor. And although, as Olivier made clear earlier, my earlier work has been in central India, perhaps one thing worth stressing in the current project is that it's attempted to exceed nation states. So I've been focusing on various locations in Nepal, various locations in Bangladesh, and a part of North India that I've not seriously worked in before, the capital, well, the city of Lucknow, the capital of Uttar Pradesh. So these images are some of the results of investigations in Panoti in the far end of the Kathmandu Valley. This is from Mymensingh in central North Bangladesh. And this is a montage from Lucknow in North India, an attempt, well, a collaboration with a local studio as part of my investigation to try and ascertain to what extent the Shia Awad heritage of Lucknow, this great 18th and 19th century architectural heritage, served as a reference point in the photographic identity of the city, of this burgeoning, increasingly politicized, increasingly Dalit city. But so the thing to draw out from there is that something happens when you move from studying photography essentially in one village in the middle of India to thinking about a broader range of photographic practices across nation states. And the hope is that they open up more general questions that perhaps are more friendly to the desire, the ontological desire, as Roland Barthes put it. This regional approach has, I think, thrown up a focus on three broad conceptual issues, theoretical issues, which I'll just briefly mention. I think the first of these concerns the troublesome unruliness of photography, which we might think of its contingency. And here, the project very much assumes that this was most perfectly expressed in the 1930s by Walter Benjamin in his Little History of Photography, and that this idea of contingency, the idea that the photographer is unable to fully control the outcome of the photographic event, is one of the key ideas that informs Ariella Azoulay's argument in Civil Contract of Photography, which, as I'll make clear shortly, has been a very important prompt to this project. The second key conceptual theme concerns the relationship of the demotic to the vernacular. And what I want to do briefly is suggest some of the arguments for using the term demotic, implying a horizontal connectedness rather than vernacular. I appreciate vernacularity has entered everyday speech, but I think once one examines its linguistic origins, one can see good reasons for thinking that it doesn't describe the positionality of popular photographic practice as well as the term demotic might. And then the third broad issue, and perhaps it's the most significant one, concerns photography's temporal orientation. And so I was been very struck throughout all this research by the ways in which the material detritus that one encounters in studios or in people's personal domestic collections of photography appear to be redolent with the past. So this is a small studio in Pinney, far eastern end of Kathmandu Valley, and very typical scenario in which you arrive, you announce that you're a visiting researcher, that you'd love to hang out in this studio, and within 10 minutes, usually the proprietor is finding out all his archaic equipment to show you, to run you through his apparatus, the history of the studio. And I want to use this image to make the obvious point that once this apparatus was cutting edge, what appears dusty and archaic now, fusty and ancient, is simply a result of the passing of time, and that we need to continually re-alert ourselves in the understanding that these were once spaces of avant-garde, cutting-edge technical progress. So I found myself here in a studio in Dhaka in Bangladesh, being shown hand tinting of medium format negatives, needing to understand that 30, 40 years ago, this was a cutting edge technology. or in Banaripara in rural Bangladesh, southern Bangladesh, when a studio proprietor brings out his old cameras, his paintbrushes, and then proceeds to show me how he used to overpaint photographs. Again, these need to be grasped as the cutting edge technologies of their day. And I think this kind of paradox for me is nowhere better summed up than in this perhaps rather disturbing image, displeasing image, again from Panoti at the far end of the Kathmandu Valley. It's a part of a disused photo studio, and it shows the effects of dozens of local portrait sitters wiping excess lipstick from their lips on the wall by the light switch in the studio just prior to arriving to have their portraits made. So when I first glimpsed this, I was struck by its kind of remarkable pastness. I mean, it seemed to be a kind of archive of all those dozens of similar gestures. It seemed to be a poignant memento mori. But it then took me some time to grasp that one needed also to understand this as powerfully futuristic and as being a portal onto an unfolding future. What one needs to do is position oneself as an anthropologist, as a viewer, as a researcher, in the position of all those uncertain women who just applied that lipstick, who then thought they had too much, wiped some off their lips, saw the wall, saw that other people had blazed a trail that legitimated this activity, and then contributed their own excess lipstick to this archive, and who then went forth in front of the lights of the studio to give their best performance. So this space, this kind of incredible transcribed event, which of course is a kind of index in its own way, is a kind of photograph of all that anxiety, aspiration, looking to the future. Well, for me, this was one of the most powerful spaces, one of the most powerful images I encountered in 3 years on and off field research in these 3 countries. So that lipstick scenario also points to the studio as a space of performance and transformation. So that was another key theme that came across during all this research. Something happens in the studio, something unpredictable happens in the studio. In part, it's because it's a space of contingency. In part, it's because of the unruliness of the image. It's also, I think, a ritual space, a theatrical space, and the anthropology of theatre and ritual continually stresses the unpredictability, the anxiety that goes along with the rigid protocols of ritual performance. And so in the Kathmandu Valley, I was continually struck by, in studios, the sight of topis, hats, these decorative hats, usually referred to as Dhaka topis, because the batik-like material that they're constructed from originated originally in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So most studios will have a little tie rack, a hat rack, where there'll be a selection of topis and ties. And the reason for this is the necessity until about 2006 to wear a dukkha topi for your Nepal citizens identification photograph. And I just wanted to read you a remarkable account by the journalist Amendra Pokharel, recalling a visit to a photo studio in 1986. I'll read about half of it out to you. The photographer asked the boy to put the shabby dukkha topi on. He shook the topi in the air twice, patted against the palms to shake out the dust, then put it on. What he saw in the mirror stunned him. Suddenly the topi mattered, even a dirty, shabby and frayed one. His Nepali identity, buried in the recess of his subconscious mind, hit his consciousness in a flash. It reminded him who he was. His dispensation towards the piece of cloth now was completely different from the slipshod manner he handled it with in the beginning. He arranged the topi with a slight tilt on the left, covering half of the forehead on the one side, and made a dent of a considerable shape at the top, the way he had seen kings, political figures, actors, and commoners wearing it on television. So Amarendra Pokharel's amazing account gives us some insight into the almost magical transformational power of the topi. So something happens in this space. What I think is so compelling about that account is that it kind of erases the conventional Tagian or Foucauldian idea that identity is something that is established and imprisoned within the photographic studio for the purposes of the state. What we have here is a much more affectively intense, transformative, exorbitant, effervescent narrative, a narrative of transformation, a narrative that I would propose to call one of alt-entity rather than identity. So if identity is about closing down one's identifications, alt-entity is about transforming, expanding, revising those identifications. And I hope to come back to that idea in a little while. So what Amendra Pokharel's amazing autobiographical account of putting on a dukkha topi in a small Nepal studio points to is the relationship between citizenship and photography. Now, in Pokharel's case, this is a literal assumption of citizenship, but it also leads neatly to Ariella Azoulay's much broader metaphorical conceptualization of photographic citizenship. And in her model, best outlined in Civil Contract of Photography, it's one of the results of the contingency and unruliness of the photographic process, and of its inclusiveness, or as Benjamin would have put it, its inability to exclude, its inability to completely stage manage, its mise en scène, its pro-filmic referent. One of the consequences of that inability is that it opens up new forms of recognition, identification, visibility. And in Azoulay's words, it opens up a citizenship of photography available in advance of ordinary political citizenship. And this was very much one of the guiding ideas behind this project. And it's worth just briefly saying that in Azoulay's argument, the evidence she adduces is overwhelmingly from photojournalism. And we wanted to test in this project Azoulay's hypotheses in the context of vernacular or demotic practice, everyday practices. However, there were various crossovers in which the demotic and the photojournalistic crisscrossed each other. And one of these was in Taslima Akhtar's work, Pulitzer Prize winner for her post Rana Plaza 2013 photography. This was documenting the death of over 1,000 workers in the collapse of a textile plant. And her work is to be seen publicly all over Dhaka because she's very active in the ready-made garment workers union. So at the top left of this image in these wall posters in Dhaka in Bangladesh, you can see many of her images. And she's also been involved with the support of Shahidul Alam and Drik and Patshala in Dhaka in various other kinds of interventions, so that she worked with the relatives of the deceased from this disaster to make quilts, memorial quilts, incorporating images of the victims of the disaster. So I had the good fortune to attend the opening of this presentation of the memorial quilts in 2017. And I asked my research assistant, Nadvi Abdullah, which of the images in these quilts he found the most harrowing, the most moving. And he pointed to this one, a group of 8 friends, all shown wearing Bangladeshi national costume, photographed on Bangladeshi National Day, a few days before the disaster. And tragically, only one of this group of 8 friends survived the disaster. And when I asked Nadvi to explain why it was that he found this to be the most moving, the most powerful image, he explained that it had to do with the fact that none of these girls appear to have had their own individual photographic image. They could only afford to be photographed as a group. So this also signaled all kinds of other kinds of disenfranchisement, like so it indicated that they wouldn't have electoral voting cards with their photo on. They wouldn't have bank loan applications with their photo on, and so on. But the general point I took from this was that Nadvi's focusing on this image pointed to a sense of the necessity of individual photographic representation as indexing political visibility more generally, so that one could think about one of the political dimensions of photographic visibility residing in what one might think of as photographability. So it was not the mere fact of having a photograph or of having a particular kind of photograph that was important, but rather the thought that in an age of rampant photographic imagery, everyone ought to have their own photographic image. And I think this very much echoes one of Azoulay's points, that often our feelings and expectations of photography are greatest where no cameras are present. So the camera has inaugurated a new regime of democratic visibility, the great power and intensity of which is made visible when we think about this image of this group of 8 female co-workers at the Rana Plaza plant. Another key issue that comes up in the cross-border thinking about these different photographic practices concerns the future. and I should explain this rather confusing presence of Delacroix's Liberty Leads the People, a celebration of the July Revolution of 1830 that was exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1831. And it features in a wonderful discussion by Siegfried Kracauer in his 1938 book on Offenbach in Paris, in where he notes that there was a continual crowd that gathered around this painting. And he says, as almost a throwaway aside, that this was because it was not just a graphic representation of the 3 glorious days of July 1830, but that it also lifted a corner of the veil that hid the future. So this idea of images, but more specifically of photography, as being capable of lifting veils that hide the future, became an important part of my thinking in sieving and mulling over the ethnographic data from this project. So this is not to say that there aren't memorializing images. There are plenty of them. This is from Bhaktapur in Kathmandu Valley, and is an image, rather wonderful image, constructed by a Qatari migrant worker, showing the importance of his family and of his local cosmos. So most of these images are temples in Bhaktapur. And memorialization, a kind of pure pastness, was also to be found in many studios in Bangladesh that still displayed images relating to the heroes of 1971, so the War of Liberation, during which Bangladesh emerged out of East Pakistan. But countervailing this, studios also frequently emerged as these cutting-edge portals into the future that I referred to earlier. And in the Kathmandu Valley, this was most apparent in terms of Newari dress, so that there's a politics of indigenization occurring, an effervescent politics of indigenization unfolding in the valley at the moment, in which different ethnic groups are staking claims to political autonomy, in large part through heritage autonomy, in which costume and traditional dress plays a big part. And in photo studios, this is referred to as cultural dress. And so most photo studios have templates displayed within them of this new cultural dress, new old. It's a neo-traditional form that's being massively revamped to articulate this future political aspiration. So this is one of the many ways in which photo studios again serve as portals for the future. They function as spaces where you go not to record a pre-existing identity, but to perform an alt entity, perform a future identity, an alternative identity that is in the process of becoming. And briefly, I think the same can be said about ID photography in general. So one very striking thing in these high migration areas is that pretty much all photo studios also function as visa application deposit centers. And they're festooned with photographs of their successful applicants from previous years. So if you think about the John Tagg Foucauldian version of ID photography in the 19th century, which is all about constraint, imprisonment, confinement, what one encounters in Nepal and Bangladesh in these high migration areas are ID photographs aspiring to be alt entity passports. conduits to other countries, other worlds, other economies. And there's a whole discourse of auspicious photography that surrounds these. The idea that certain studios are lucky. And so I encountered several times studio proprietors who narrated clients, often the children of earlier clients who'd walked or traveled, many, many miles to come to a particular studio because it was the studio where their father had had their visa photograph made that then allowed them to travel to Saudi on a laboring contract. So even ID photographs that may seem to fit that tag Foucault model of capture by the discursive context of the state can be reconceptualized in the light of what the sitters, the subjects of these images being made now have to say about the way in which they load their hopes and aspirations onto these images. Of course, that's not incompatible with these photographs doing the work of ideological mystification in support of global capitalism. So this whole past-future question has come to preoccupy me centrally in thinking about this new fieldwork data. This is the cover to that first book, Camera Indica, that we were discussing at the beginning, 1997. And the cover image shows a picture of Ramlal holding a picture of Hira, holding a picture of his father. So the father, the smallest photo, had died maybe 10 years ago. Hira was then killed, the middle figure was killed in a train accident. Ramlal is still alive. I chose that image because it seemed to be a perfect kind of pictorial mise en abîme. It seemed to conjure a sense of the image falling backward in time. The older it got, the smaller it became. And I think it spoke to my sense of the photography as somehow ontologically linked to a pastness. Now I would want to stress its ontological links to futurity. And so Hira, the middle figure in this image, the man that is holding the small framed image of his father, is now to be encountered in this form in this village in central India. And these are his two cousins holding the image. And this memorial image, which has been heavily photoshopped and is re-photoshopped every couple of years, now functions as a shamanic presence in curative and advice sessions held in this Dalit family and the wider Dalit community. So the photograph of Hira, rather than being trapped in the past, is brought out once a month on the day of his death, the lunar day that marks his death. And the image speaks through an intermediary, through a ghorla or shaman, who articulates Hira's advice for those that are suffering illness, exam anxiety, marriage problems, economic misfortune, and so on. So part of my experience over 40 years in this village has been from experiencing images that seem to fall backwards into the past, as here, to those that are continually falling forward into the present. That's the kind of standard Hindu memorial image. So ancestors should be worshipped for 7 generations. But frequently these ancestors are not inert. They continue to intervene to give advice to the living. And very much the same was observed in Bhaktapur in Nepal on the festival of Gai Jatra, where these amazing, what Niels Gutschauer refers to as cow scaffolds, they're wooden structures that imitate cattle, to which are affixed photographs of everyone in Bhaktapur who has died in the previous year. And this is an effervescent procession that lasts all day, that moves several times around the ritual center of the city, and is really a procedure, a technical procedure to move on the dead across the river Vetuni to the underworld. So in a similar way, one can think about these, or this enormous ritual procession, this incredible complex endeavor, as being about moving the dead on, progressing them into a future rather than securing them in the past. And so thinking about futurity, thinking about images that lift the veil that hides the future, to recall Krakow, then seemed to provide a way of thinking about lots of images that I encountered on my travels around Nepal. So this is from Birganj. This is the aspirations of a young migrant worker to be, who dreams of traveling to the Gulf. Of course, a lot of ideological mystification on behalf of super exploitative capitalism going on here. But this is not photography in the service of the future. It's not. This is a long way from what Pierre Bourdieu called the solemnizing function of the photographic image. Other images like this from Panoti in the Kathmandu Valley also seem to speak to, well, a desire to lift the veil that hides the future. And also speaks, I think, to a deterritorialization, which was also a key feature of much demotic imagery. So I did find a few images, such as these in Bangladesh, that celebrate the central position of 1971, i.e. the emergence of Bangladesh from East Pakistan. So the Sava Martyrs Memorial on the left serves as a photographic backdrop. On the right, the Language Martyrs Memorial serves as a backdrop. But these were fairly few and far between. Much more typical, in my experience, was a place like Jaflong up in northern Bangladesh, right on the border with the Indian state of Meghalaya. And you can just see the river Pian in the background there. And tourists from both the Bangladeshi side and the Indian side come in order to sit in the river here and be photographed in this liminal space. So it strikes me as the perfect photographic performance of deterritorialization, of a desire to transcend the nation state. And commercial photographers, of whom there are about 30 that make a living in this very curious tourist destination, specializes in images in which people point to the beyond. So if you're in Bangladesh, you point to India, you point to what is other than you. And if you're in India, you do vice versa. And then if you're lucky enough to be within earshot of an Indian visitor sitting on another rock in the same river, you can exchange WhatsApp numbers. and then build a communicative relationship that cements this deterritorializing aspiration. I was unable to go to Pakistan as originally planned as part of this project because of COVID travel restrictions, but Daniel Shah, a young PhD student, did research on my behalf and came across some remarkable images from Quetta that also speak to deterritorialization. So this shows in the middle the Durand line, the artificial border of Afghanistan, separating Afghanistan at the north from the Pashtun-speaking areas of Pakistan at the left. And the young Pakistani boy on the left is draped in an Afghanistani flag. So photography here is used very explicitly, albeit in this complex montage, and you might want to say, you know, paralinguistic form to advocate for new forms of nation state. So this is explicitly deterritorializing. And there's a lot more one could say about the politicality, of the direct politicality of much of the Quetta Pakistani imagery. Maybe we can come back to that in the questions, because it was that those themes were much more muted in Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. So deterritorialization is also apparent in terms of backdrops, photo studio backdrops, now of course largely digitally generated and shared between studios. These are a selection from 700 that I was given by a small tumble down shack called Rixon Studios in a part of rural southern Bangladesh called Banaripara. This is the view from opposite that studio that was using these backdrops. This is the route to Banipara. I'm hoping that these 3 slides produce a sense of visual difference, a sense that the backdrops are taking you or offer you the promise of being taken to somewhere elsewhere. And that, it strikes me, as a very, you know, key and continuing liberating function of photography. So even if one's looking at early Nepali montages or those images from Lucknow studios that may appear quaint, you know, we need to grasp that the telephone was the cutting edge. It was the internet of its moment. Or Central India, studio in Nagda, Studio Suag. These images in the late 70s were taken at a time when there were almost certainly no working phones in this town. The only 2 phones were in this photo studio. So if you wanted to perform the act of being connected, of being modern, you went to the photo studio. Ditto if you wanted to perform being a pop star, being a disco dancer. This relates to a film called I Am a Disco Dancer, a Bollywood movie. It was very popular at the time. The photo studio allows you to participate in that ecumen. If you want to drive your motorbike past this fantastic Fritz Lang scenography, the photo studio allows you to do it. If you want to ride with your bicycle with your transistor radio hung off the handlebars, it's the photo studio where you do it. If you want to play with your Sputnik doll, this is from Photo Concern 1960, Kathmandu. If you want to be a modern baby, the photo studio is where you record that. Or if you want to celebrate photography's role in consolidating modernity, it's the photo studio that allows you to do that. I have many more examples that I'll skip over. I can see time is very limited, and I just wanted to say that there are other themes that we could pursue if we had time, such as the role of digital backdrops in consolidating what we might think of as a neoliberal aesthetic, how that relates to, and how the digital relates to the new increasingly right-wing politics in India, the Hindutva, Hinduizing politics of India. And if we had time, then I'd present a countervailing narrative that says something about Dalit, i.e. lower caste investments in photography, how photography allows Dalits to get closer to the gods. It allows them a closeness to the gods that they may not be allowed in actual non-photographic physical space. How photography allows actions freed of their negative consequences, so that meat-eating lifestyles often celebrated photographically in Dalit photography, whereas in Brahmanic higher caste visual propaganda, they're stigmatized. These are illustrations from the book Lessons from Hell that Olivier referred to at the beginning, and I'd be happy to talk about in the discussion. So Dalits have Dalits are certainly availing of photography in all kinds of ways to re-sacralize and also to democratize and secularize. I see we're at 10 o'clock, so maybe I won't talk about ritual practices of photography. These relate to a genre called Manorat, to be found in North India. And these come from Dakshin Kali in Nepal. And both of them, in my estimation, are about trying to impose a ritual conformity that eliminates and suppresses contingency. However, they prove to be completely incapable of fully suppressing contingency. And I think there's an important theoretical point to extract from this, which is that if you study photography ethnographically, you encounter all kinds of variant practices. And it strikes me that the reaction to this need not be, look, there are variations in practice, therefore there are multiple photographies, i.e. no single photography or photographing. The alternative argument is to say that what these images do, these ritual templates do, is diagnose and draw attention to an underlying ontological feature of photography, which they try to suppress. So they may in fact be signposts to an underlying ontological normativity rather than its opposite. And then the final question I'll just mention before I wrap up in the next 3 minutes is returning to the question of photojournalism versus the demotic. So Azoulay's model is very much predicated on photojournalistic practice. And it's true that, much of this research threw up incredibly rich traditions of photojournalistic practice that are very little known. This is Min Ratna Bajracharya with an image from 1990 called Dawn of Freedom that's very famous in Nepal. And this, if one was writing a history of photojournalism in Nepal, this would have pride of place in it. There are other equally important photojournalists such as Gopal Chitrakar, who in 1990 produced a book, People Power, that had a huge impact on visualizing a new public and played a very important role in unfolding political protests. Then at the end of the Civil War from 1996 to 2006, Kunda Dixit's book project, and exhibition project, A People War, built upon this and is, to my mind, surely as significant as Steichen's Family of Man project, but Kunda Dixit remains little known. There is even a Maoist riposte to this, organized by Dinesh Shrestha, who you can see here pointing at one of the images from his archive. So what I'm trying to say in brief is that photojournalism is alive and well, is in an extremely vigorous state, but it finds itself up against other modalities, other publics. And perhaps one way of bringing this into stark contrast is by thinking about Min Ratna Bajracharya's argument about what he calls the power of the third eye, which was used as a subtitle to his illustrations in a book by Prakash Raj, The Dance of Democracy. And for Min, the power of the third eye meant something akin to Azoulay's secular photographic lens. The third eye was the additional power of democracy that the camera could bring to politics. And when I encountered that, his subtitle, The Power of the Third Eye, it put me in mind of an image I'd long known from central India, dating from 2011, which was snapped by a priest who was wandering down the high street of this village. He looked up to his left and he saw that a group of villagers were installing a brass kalash. This is a kind of brass cupola, the final element to be mounted atop a new Shiva temple. And he noticed as this kalash was being installed that Shiv was sending down a beam of fire. So the god Shiv was illuminating and energizing this kalash as a mark of respect and affirmation. So we have two completely opposed third eyes here, the one, to put it crudely, secular, the other not so secular, the one operating in the space of what Benjamin would call empty homogeneous time, the other operating in what Benjamin would call messianic time. Now, I had a long story about other messianic times, but I won't detain us with them, although I'm happy to talk about them in the discussion if that's appropriate. But I just end with the final 3 slides, and the final 4 slides, in fact, and comment on the career of the Panchmukhi Nag, the 5-headed cobra, who's recently made a photographic appearance. So this messianic space is completely consonant with the digital. In fact, it's facilitated by the digital. The fact that Hindu citizen journalists have mobile phones with cameras in their pockets means that they're generating much more of that messianic worldview. So this image appeared in a newspaper about 15 years ago, then was laminated and sold as a print for putting in puja worship rooms by a local photo studio. This is one in the room of the house I most often stay in the village. It's since been upgraded digitally by a better Photoshop. And so the question this raises is, what kind of publics is the camera appealing to here? does Azoulay's model work if we think in terms of a secular public, the Habermasian public? And conversely, are we confronted here with what Michael Warner called a counter-public? So just to wrap up, and this is the final slide, I mean, among the things I've been trying to say is that photographs point to the future as much as the past. They're performative, transformative, transgressive, and point to unknown destinations. The demotic might be a more useful adjective than vernacular. The future is uncertain, homogeneous empty time giving way to messianic time, the third eye of democracy, or Shiv's eye. But photography has always been not quite secular. That's a wonderful term I take from Kajuri Jain. So that public, counter-public might be itself the product of a certain kind of nostalgia. Did the Habermasian public ever really exist? And then finally, the suggestion is that we deal not with photography versus photographies. So that was the kind of stale essentializing noun versus the Foucauldian John Tagg liberating fragmentation into practice-based, discursively constituted multiple photographies. But my alternative suggestion is that we look at photography in the world as actual practice, photographing as a gerund. Okay.
Thanks for also wrapping up. We still have some time for some questions. There's a couple in the list, and thankfully you've dealt with one of mine, which was going to be addressing photojournalism. But I'll skip straight to the question here. You just mentioned mobile phones, so I might take that one first from Helen, who says it's a wonderful presentation and also points to the fact that perhaps you haven't strayed from your E.P. Thompson roots as far as you may have put it at the onset. And she asks, has there been a noticeable reduction in studio photography in Kathmandu and Bangladesh, or perhaps other parts of your fieldwork, as people move to mobile phones? I know you suggest here that the photo studios are the only place where landline phones are, but the mobile media research tells us that one of the areas of major expansion of mobile media has been in migrant worker communities, for example, in Hong Kong and East Asia. You also pointed to this kind of futurity pointing towards the Gulf. What do you make there of the I guess the space of mobile phones coming into this?
Yeah, well, thank you for that very interesting question. No, mobile phones are a huge part of this, although they're a relatively belated part of it. So I think, you know, in that central Indian village that I've mostly worked in, and it was only in 2015, really, that a surge of mobiles arrived. So that there was they were like 10 years behind the curve, waiting for cheap China mobiles, as they're called. So yes, there's a puzzle here, which is the tenacity of the studio. I mean, so I assumed that there wouldn't be any photo studios in many of these places, and it turned out there are actually quite a lot of photo studios, and until recently there were many, many more. So I calculated that in I think 2010 in Nepal, this is on the basis of the distribution of color labs, i.e. color printing facilities that served clusters of 30 studios. There appeared to be something like 5,000 to 6,000 photo studios in Nepal, you know, which to my mind is an amazing number when you think that mobile phones will have completely destroyed that section of the market. Well, most studios do complain about retrenchment, Most elderly studio proprietors don't think they're going to be handing on their businesses as studios to their sons. So it's there's certainly a sense of retrenchment and crisis. But very often I would, be seated, listening to these proprietors' laments about the future of their businesses, and there'd be a steady stream of clients coming in wanting ID photos, prospective marriage photos, or coming in with their mobiles and doing Bluetooth transfers because they wanted paper prints. But beyond that, I think the reason studios in South Asia are not imminently about to disappear, and in fact is still, excuse me, a very important part of the landscape. I ought also to add that in the town of Nagda, which is the town that Camera Indica is mainly focused on, which now has a population of 240,000. The best estimate is there are 50 to 60 viable photo studios there currently. So we're not talking about a mere handful that are about to disappear. They're a significant part of local economies. And I think the reason for their tenacity is that you have bureaucratic states, extremely bureaucratic states, that demand ID, paper, passport photos for all kinds of forms, bank loan applications, etc., etc. Almost any bit of official paper will require a stapled photograph, often multiple staple photographs. There's then, I think, the very tenacious idea that studio proprietors act as theatrical impresarios and are able to produce images that mobiles aren't. So I mean, in part, this is a question of apparatus. So that, there is a huge difference in the optical ability of an average China phone versus a Nikon or Canon DSLR. But then I think probably the third and most important factor is the tenacity of marriage, arranged marriage, formal marriage, which are the main earners for these studios. The studios live off marriages, and they're very adept at devising ever more expensive marriage products. So like laminated photo books are the current money maker of choice. So you for a decent sized marriage in a small town like Nagda in central India, you would hire one of the better studios. You would expect to have 3 or 4 camera and video people more or less in continuous attendance over say 3 or 4 days. You would expect them to generate a minimum of 800 still photographs. Would then have them design on Photoshop a laminated photo books with a video disc insert. I mean, you're talking about 50,000, 100,000. You're talking about enormous quantities of money.
There's one question here. I'm conscious that we're up for time. Asking about, could you say more about the value of keeping a focus on the medium photography? And I think that that's what you have suggested in your conclusion. So moving towards the gerund photographing. I know in your, I'd like to sort of take things in a slightly different direction, to ask you to draw, I guess, connections between what you've talked about here and the space of art photography. I know elsewhere in your writing, in your essay on 7 theses of photography, you discuss at some length the work of Pushpamala N, who will be familiar to I think some people listening, of course, who references this space of the studio as well as colonial photography and the sort of performativity, futurity, pastness, all these sorts of things that you've suggested in a demotic mode. Where does that fall between the sort of the work of Azoulay that you've sort of tested through the Photodemos project and your own work on studio photography? Where do you sort of position that kind of work?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you're right. I found Pushpamala N's work extraordinarily productive. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of her studio portrait that often recreate scenes from popular movies, and in which part of the artwork involves a scrupulous, incredibly detailed listing of where all the elements for the making of the photograph came from. So, you know, she'll give you the address of the place where they bought the lino. They'll give you the name of the paint that was used in the backdrop. And so there's all this kind of material, apparently superfluous material information, but which is ineluctably drawing your eye or your mind to the pro-filmic, the space of the production. So I think that Pushpamala's work made me finally understand Benjamin on contingency, on the photographic event. So I think what Pushpamala's documentation does is absolutely insist that this was an event. We had to get all this stuff together. It may be an imaginative project. We had to have an idea, a template, a thought, but then we had to make it, we had to do it, we had to perform it. So I think it's the kind of insistence of her pointing to the photographic event that then made me grasp the importance of that for Benjamin, which in turn I think is the bedrock for Azoulay's argument about the citizenship of photography, because something happens in photography, accidental, contingently, that in the case of her key image dethrones the sovereign. So that, the point then being that whatever the photographer hopes to achieve, thinks they might achieve, is very likely not to be achieved. Pushpamala then also introduces very powerfully the space of the performative. And I think, that's something I tried to fuse with Roland Barthes' discussion of the distinction between core and corpus in camera lucida, the idea that the photograph you get, as the result of that performance and the exposure, has its own integrity. To ask whether it's true or false is not the right sort of question. So that would take one on to a rather more complex argument that maybe we should save for 2 weeks' time. Yeah. But I'm coming back to your general provocation, Olivier. I mean, I found it powerfully to be the case that thinking about what artists do, good artists, clever, imaginative artists, as opposed to the not so good ones, thinking with that work, can be incredibly useful for conventional academic theoretical thinking.
I think I'm going to have to wrap it up there, but it makes me think actually about the way that you also your own photographs, your own photography from field work and so on, thinking through the visual for your academic and theoretical work. There is one more question in the Q&A, but I'm very conscious of your time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. And I thank you very much, also our audience, and for those questions. We are recording, and thank you very much for agreeing to that as well, Chris, so that we can share this online. There was a comment of somebody joining from Bangladesh complaining about the time. It's 4 a.m. in the morning, and they want to catch the rest of your talk, so they can. which is great. Thank you very much for joining us again, to our audience, and Chris, for your generous sharing of this research.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Olivier. I look forward to the next event.
Thank you.